Hey everyone, welcome to today's ParaBoss webinar. For those of you who are new to ParaBoss, ParaBoss is Australia's resource for the control of worms, lice, flies and ticks, and all our favourite species of animals, the cattle, sheep and goats. Today online I have with me Megan Rogers, who is our ParaBoss extension lead, and she will be joining us a little later. And myself, I'm Fiona MacArthur, for those of you who haven't met me yet, and I'm a member of the ParaBoss extension team. ParaBoss is a joint initiative of Australian Wool Innovation, Meat and Livestock Australia, the University of New England and Animal Health Australia. Today our presentation will be on managing black scaleworm with Dr. Andrew Whale, who I will introduce to you all in a moment. So I'd warmly like to invite Dr. Andrew Whale to join us. Andrew was born and raised down in southern New South Wales. He's got a strong interest in livestock and started breeding white Suffolks back in 1995. He studied vet science at Charles Sturt Uni down in Wagga Wagga, down for me, up for some of you. And he's a consultant director and veterinarian at LivestockLogic down in Hamilton in Victoria. He's currently joining us from the side of the road on the way to a vet conference. So we love our presenters when they will stop and deliver wherever they are. So thanks, Andrew. It's lovely to have you today.
I just need to, oh, there we go, beautiful.
So Andrew will share his screen from his end. I have that up for you now, Andrew. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Well, thanks for having me, guys. And welcome to everyone. Yeah, today's we're going to focus on black scaleworm. Quite interestingly, I've just been looking at some photos from a client at Harden, whose sheep no doubt have black scaleworm, which is quite interesting because I've been looking for a good photo. I was trying to find one for this presentation, which I wasn't able to, but I'll be able to stick that into one in the future. So it's a very good topic, and good to hear that we've got people from all around the country online. Why won't it change? There we go. So talking about black scaleworm today. So it is from the scientific group of worms called Trichostrongylus, and there's subspecies of these worms, which I've got in front of you there. So there's Colibriformis, Vetrinus, Rugatus, and Axi. Colibriformis and Vetrinus are the two we see the most of, and depending on where you're coming from, so I'm based in Hamilton, Southwest Vic, and Vetrinus is what we see the most of. It's really prominent in our winter dominant rainfall. As you go into areas where there's more summer rain, you'll see more Colibriformis, and for the most part, you don't have to worry about the other two, but I will point out that Axi is one of the few worm species that does cross between sheep and cattle. So it is an important species. We tend not to see it causing as much damage as Colibriformis and Vetrinus, and that's one of the reasons why co-grazing with sheep and cattle can be and goats, as in cattle have worms that very few cross back over to sheep and goats. So if running cattle, if you've got sheep or goats, does really significantly reduce, or has the potential to significantly reduce the number of worms that you're dealing with on your farm, because you're essentially breaking that life cycle. And just these all fall under the strong guile category, and I just want to point that out because often you'll see the word strong guile on a worm egg count that you get it done, and that's the family of roundworms that these worms come under, which also Barbus bowl and brown stomach worm, which is Osteotargs and Homunculus contortus, also fall under the strong guile category. So just sometimes people get a bit confused about why all these different scientific terms, but and I know it is confusing, but the three main species all fall under the strong guile category. So look, where do they live? This is important. You might think, oh, why do we care about where they live? But it is important to know where they live, because it affects. This is why we see the disease that we see with black scaleworm. So they live in the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. So essentially, there's three parts of the small intestine. This is the bit immediately following the abomasum, which is the last stomach in the sheep, goat, or cattle. And why is this important? The small intestine is responsible for absorbing water and nutrients from the gastrointestinal tract. So when you think about that, when we get worms that cause significant damage to the intestines that are responsible for absorbing water and nutrients, that is obviously going to prevent the animal from being able to absorb that water and the nutrients, which gives us the clinical signs that we see with this worm, which is the black scours. And that results in severe dehydration and lost weight gain. So initially, we'll see sheep a little bit like in this photo, which may or may not be worms, but we'll see scouring as the first sign. Obviously, we get increased DAG buildup depending on the DAG score of the animal, and that leads to significant weight loss and death through dehydration. And I just want to point out that how quickly sheep can go from being very, very healthy to dying. It can be a matter of 10 days with this worm, and that will depend on where you live. And I'm coming from Hamilton, southwest Victoria, where we have a long, cold winter, and our worm buildup can be high, and animals are often nutritionally compromised. And yeah, it's as little as 10 days that these animals can be healthy in a paddock to significant mortality events occurring. This is the life cycle of worms. Now, don't try and read all this now, but the one thing I really wanted to talk about was the role in the host in particular, and I guess this is this section through here. But the main thing, the main thing I wanted to talk about was that it takes 18 to 21 days from the day a sheep ingests worm eggs off the pasture before they ingest larvae off the pasture, before those develop into an adult within the animal, and that adult worm starts to lay eggs. So it's a really important thing to be aware of when we think about interpreting an egg count. And essentially what it's telling us, or what this means for you guys, is that the day we drench a sheep with an effective drench, that egg count should be 0 for a minimum of 18 days. And why is that important? It's important because if we test the animal on day 18, that egg count should be 0. And I guess what I don't want people seeing is an egg count within that 18-day period that's very, very low, and thinking that they don't have worms coming through, because that egg count can go from 0 at 18 up to a week later, day 25, being 200 eggs per gram, which can be very damaging. And I will talk you through some examples, but it's a really key thing that whoever looks at an egg count must understand this life cycle, because a lot of people think about a number as the time to drench, and that is true, but it's the number's only good to know if you know the time at which they were last drenched, because that they do build up, or they have the potential to build up very, very quickly from week 3 to week 4 to week 5. Once you get an egg count that's 5 or 6 weeks post drenching, you start to have confidence that it's not going to change really quickly. But from week 3 to week 4, there can be a dramatic change. And I think it's something that producers fail to understand. And in reality, is probably a lot of advisors really fail to ask that question of when was sheep last drenched. And with black scour worm, and barber spole and osteotargs, you can see very, very quick changes in those worm egg count levels. And I will talk you through some examples later. The other thing that's important to know is just how long these worms survive. And we are talking about black scour worm today, which is, essentially it's a winter worm for the most part. And our pastures remain infected for up to 6 months. So when we talk about resting a paddock and, to make sure it's clean, it's got to be rested for more than 6 months, essentially, over our winter period before we start to see worm levels really start to come down, and more like 3 months over summer. So just think about that if you've taken sheep off a paddock and growth cattle that had a significant worm challenge and you rest it for 6 to 8 weeks, that doesn't make the pasture any more safe than what it was 6 to 8 weeks earlier. So it's a really significant time that we need to have these pastures, not necessarily free of sheep, but free of animals that are relatively non-wormy. So, and again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. The second point there, that it takes 3 weeks from the time an animal is effectively drenched before new infections can be picked up in an egg count. I've discussed that, and I'll talk you through some specific examples to try and really get that message across. So these are what is there? 5 examples here of egg counts taken at different times since a last drench. And when I say weeks since the last drench, I'm talking about a drench that doesn't have any residual activity. So talking about something like a triple combination or an abamectin or a white or a clear. I'm not talking about using a moxidectin that has a residual activity, which I'll talk about that later. So first of all, if we test some animals that were drenched 3 weeks ago and they come back at 0, this doesn't tell us anything about how wormy the paddock is. This is, in reality, it's just a drench check, and it's telling us that the drench has worked very, very effectively. And I can give you 0 guidance as to when those animals might need to be drenched next. It's too early to know how much larvae they've picked up. Whereas if we test them again a week later and it's still at 40 eggs per gram, or it's still stayed low at 40 eggs per gram, I'm really comfortable they haven't picked up a lot of worms, but I'd still like us to come back in and test them sort of 2 weeks later. And some people might go, gee, 2 weeks later seems ridiculous. In my environment, it's definitely not ridiculous to test those again 2 weeks later. But if you're coming from a lower stocking rate region, that hasn't had the long growing season, and you know that there's not a lot of larvae out on pastures, then you might be happy pushing that out to sort of 3 to 4 weeks. If, however, we test them at 4 weeks and they come back at 140 eggs per gram, that most people would say that's a low egg count and there's no need to drench. And if someone just gave me the number, that's exactly what I would think. But knowing that they were drenched only 4 weeks ago, and that we're essentially only picking up on 1 week's worth of worms that are now at the adult stage within the animal, this is a concerning egg count, and it's going to get high really, really quickly. And if I had to guess, I'd say it will double in 7 days. At which point, most of the time, I'd be advising someone to put it in the schedule to drench these animals within the next week. The same egg count taken 7 weeks since they were drenched is a very low drench, a very low number of worms that animal's picked up. So I guess making the point, the numbers are identical, but one's taken 4 weeks post drenching, one's taken 7, and therefore 140. Where I would be saying to someone, let's retest them in 3 weeks, and I would be expecting that group of sheep to be, probably needing drenching around about 3 weeks time. And another number of 30 eggs per gram taken at the same time, I'd be really comfortable pushing out that retest to 5 weeks, knowing that our farm's got very low levels of contamination up until this point. So I guess I'm just trying to ram home the message that this life cycle is really key to interpreting an egg count with all worms. So just as important with barber's pole and Ostertags, they all have this sort of 3 week lag period, and that's probably another way of putting it is our egg counts are 3 weeks old, because it takes 3 weeks from a larvae ingested today to be putting out eggs in the feces. So just a key thing that I think as an industry we need to really understand that. The remonitoring periods here are going to vary a lot depending on, as I said before, the climate, the stocking rate, how good a job you've done at monitoring the stock for the last 6 months. And I think a really good example is the difference between Southwest Victoria traditionally and the Riverina. We would expect people to be monitoring 2 to 3 times as often in Southwest Victoria than what we would in the Riverina. But if we think about how the Riverina's been in the last 2 years, the need for monitoring has really escalated with rainfall. So there's we've got a higher risk here in areas that are often lower rainfall, and that's essentially you add water, you do grow grass, but you also allow worms to survive a lot longer, or their life cycle to continue for longer in the year than what they normally would. So as always, refer to your advisor for specific recommendations. I just want to talk about when we do end up with problems in a flock, and I don't mean to sort of belittle people that have problems, and I run a farm myself, and we've had issues with black scaleworm. It does happen, but generally it does take months of poor management to allow large numbers of worms to build up and for sheep to become heavily infected. So while it can be a 10-day period from them being healthy to being unhealthy, the contamination that's occurred has happened in the 3 to 6 months prior. And that's really the best way to prevent that, is through really regular monitoring of our stock to ensure that we don't contaminate pastures heavily. And the other thing I want to point out here is that in most parts of Australia, we do have a relatively hot summer. And that is, that's our best friend when it comes to killing worms. And that sun bakes worms, it kills them, but it only does that if we actually remove all the worms, or the majority of the worms, from the sheep. So if we have sheep putting worm burdens out all summer and early autumn, the sun won't be able to do the role that we would hope it would be able to in terms of killing worms. So it's a combination of regular monitoring of worms and summer drenching to ensure that we don't take heavy black scale worm levels into the winter growing season, when worms really do often, this worm in particular, really does get a hold of stock. So how do we identify a problem, and how do we reduce the likelihood of the problem? It is relatively simple. It's egg count, and a little bit of larval cultures. But egg counts are the key to ensuring that we don't get left with problems in winter. It's the only way to pick up on worm burdens until, apart from waiting for the scouring and waiting for the reduced weight gain or deaths. And if we're waiting for animals to start to show signs of worms, the reality is we've missed the boat big time. For you to visually pick up on a worm problem in sheep, you've lost 3, 5, 6 kilos in an animal, which grain prices for us down in Hamilton at the moment are pushing $500 a tonne because we're so close to the port. To put that sort of weight back on an animal, you're talking 25 kilos of grain, like $12 an animal. You simply can't afford to be doing it, and egg counts are the key to early prevention, to keep productive livestock, but more importantly, to actually stop contamination of paddocks, so that over the next 6 months we don't have to be drenching as frequently. So I guess just trying to encourage that you've got to be really proactive with your egg counts to keep this worm from becoming all over the farm and then high frequency of drenching. Larval cultures. So I think larval cultures have an important place on farm, but I don't think they're, because of the lag period in when we get a larval culture back from when we do an egg count of sort of 10 to 14 days, they're often not that useful to make a decision on the mob you've just tested. So what I advocate to people is to do regular larval cultures to get a bit of an idea of what worms are on the farm, so that when you get an egg count back, you can have confidence that it is most likely going to be barber's pole, or it is most likely going to be black scaleworm. And why that is important is because our thresholds for drenching between barber's pole and black scaleworm, and probably the point at which we see significant production loss, are very different between those two worm species. And in really simple terms, barber's pole worms put out 10 times the eggs that black scaleworm does. So see here, and across the middle of the page, that an egg count of 250 for black scaleworm is very similar to an egg count of 2,500 for barber's pole. Both of those will be starting to cause production loss with those worm species, but not at significant levels yet. And that, I think people get a really big shock with this, because if you come from a high barber's pole region, you think 250 is probably not a very high egg count, but it is for black scaleworm. And likewise, if you come from where I live, southwest Victoria, an egg count of 2,500, you expect sheep to be dead everywhere in the paddock, but with barber's pole, they tend not to be dying at an egg count that low. I'd still be drenching at that point. So the key thing is knowing the species of worms that are on your farm helps you make good decisions, but you need to sort of have those larval cultural changes ahead of you, or ahead of time, before you see the egg count. Because if you see an egg count of 500 and wonder, is it black scour or is it barber's pole, wait 14 days. If it's black scour worm, they're going to start dying before you get your larval culture back. So I guess in practice, I like to see people invest in more fecal egg counts and less larval cultures, but enough larval cultures so that they've got an indication of what worm species are present on the farm throughout the year and for those different times, because they will change significantly with the seasons. So, black scour worm, time of year for monitoring and the frequency of monitoring, just some guidelines that I would give people based on whether it's winter or based on whether it's hot and dry, or whether it's wet and cold, and for different ages of animals. So our lambs and kids that are less than 12 months of age, and really, I mean, our young cattle fall into this category as well. Any cattle under 18 months of age doesn't have a very strong immunity to worms yet, so they're all very similar. But up until 15 months of age, they're all highly susceptible to worms. I would like to see monitoring every 2 to 4 weeks, and 2 weeks in a high challenge area, out to 4 weeks in a lower challenge area. Whereas summer, I'm happy to sort of double the time period between egg counts. And in our adults, sort of 3 to 8 weeks in our high challenge periods, and 6 to 12 weeks outside of those high challenge periods. So, and don't forget, and while trikes are probably not the worm species that really change in a wet summer, but we don't just go summer, we don't need to monitor. That's dependent on rainfall and green feed. And essentially the way to think about it is, if you've got grass growing, then you've got worms surviving, and you need to be more on the ball with the frequency of monitoring. Other things that will change that need to monitor will be stocking rate. Obviously, the more animals you've got, the heavier the contaminated the pastures become, and the need for drenching increases. The percentage of sheep and goat as a proportion of the stocking rate versus cattle. And I guess if someone's wall-to-wall sheep or goats, they're going to need to do a hell of a lot more monitoring than someone that's 50% sheep or goats and 50% cattle, or someone that's 70 or 80% cropping. You've got a wonderful relief valve for sort of 6 months of the year, where you can utilise stubbles and stop contamination of your pastures. So that percentage of sheep and goats and cattle as a comparison of the whole farm is really important. Rainfall, farm history, and genetics. And I guess genetics is one that we're seeing pretty substantial improvements in, with people selecting low egg count animals, which reduce the contamination on the farm. So just going into that a little bit further, genetics, there's sort of two components to this. There's one, we need animals that are resilient to worms. We don't really have a really good measure on that, except to say that, I guess I encourage people to think about, when you're going and buying, rams, bulls, for your flock and herd, is think about animals that you want animals that can stand up to your environment. So if you're going and buying animals that are coming from a 400 mil rainfall and you're in an 800 mil rainfall, how do you have any confidence that that animal is going to handle the challenges that your environment brings? Which one of them is worms. I mean, sheep are a classic, where feet can be a big problem when you bring animals from a different environment into yours. And I want to make the point that I'm not saying sheep from a low rainfall won't stack up in your environment, but have they been tested, and do you know that they will? So whereas animals that are in your environment and are bred in your environment, you have good confidence that they will actually handle your environment. So possible they still will be okay, but have they been challenged? And then the other component to genetics is animals with less worm eggs. Now, regardless of the environment you're in, we do know we have ASBVs, which can be used to select animals that put out less eggs. And what that means is is those sheep will cause less contamination of the farm, which as you get more and more of those sheep on your farm, or as you shift the genetic pool to be lower for ASBVs, for worm egg count, you will see less drenching required on your farm. So it's sort of pretty, well, it's a very tried and tested method now that we're seeing with all breeds of sheep, that the drenching frequency can be reduced through genetic selection. Grazing techniques, I'll touch on a little bit. Feeding appropriately, I think this is a big one that we've seen great improvements from things like lifetime ewe management at the course, where we've fed sheep better, and with no other changes but better condition score management of sheep. We're seeing that animals are far more resilient to worms, and when you think about that, their immune system is functioning better because they're in good condition, and they're able to handle worm burdens a lot better. So getting nutrition right is a really important part of managing worms. And as I said before, but worm egg count, so we're not over drenching. So that, there's two components. One, we're reducing the pasture contamination, so that sheep are drenched before they shed lots of worms. And the other one is that we're just not exposing worms to unnecessary chemicals because of over drenching. And so we're only drenching when a worm egg count threshold determines the need for drenching. Grazing techniques. So I think this is something that I think maybe I feel like it's slipped a little bit over recent times, and I think there's a number of reasons why, but I think a lot of farming businesses have become more one species rather than probably mixed species. And I sort of touched on that a little bit before, but if we can have sheep and cattle, not necessarily co-grazing in the one paddock, but co-grazing across the farm, and we can use them to swap between areas of the farm, we can really reduce the number of worms that build up on the farm. And a good example of that, of people I know, is where they might essentially they have a 6-month rotation between young cattle and young sheep or young goats, and that effectively meaning that it's only 6 months of the year where you're seeing worm species that can cross-contaminate, affecting animals. So has a really significant reduction in the need for drenching on those farms. And when you think about the life cycle and the fact it doesn't just build up within 6 or 8 weeks, it takes, as I said before, it takes months essentially of poor management before you end up with a significant worm burden. If we can be going relatively worm-free at the start of that 6-month period, it makes it very hard for worms to be at high levels by the time those sheep are then moving to the other part of the farm. So that sort of 6-month rotation with those high-risk sheep, young sheep and young cattle or young goats, does work very effectively to reduce contamination for those young animals. It's less important with adult sheep and adult cattle because they have a much better resilience or to cope with higher worm burdens. So when we think about the high-risk stock, particularly weaners, sheep and cattle are the two we're really concerned about. Lactating ewes, and I've got lactating ewes, they're not cattle, because most mature cattle have a very good resilience to be able to handle worm burdens, provided they're in reasonable condition. And any other animal under significant nutritional stress is also a high-risk animal. And that's where often we assume wethers are highly resilient to worms, and they are if they're in good condition. But a lot of people, and the most profitable way generally to run wethers is run them at a lighter condition score, because they are only cutting us wool, not obviously lactating or producing a lamb. We tend to run them at a lower condition score, particularly in winter. So we've got to be mindful to think about those animals as a potential high risk group during our winter months, and particularly with black scourworm over that winter period. So we've got to think about how do we prepare a clean paddock. As I said before, cattle only for the 6 months prior sets up a paddock as a very clean environment. Graze with sheep or goats with a known low burden. And this is something where, with really good monitoring, we can have confidence that we've created relatively clean paddocks. Because it's all good and well to say, let's leave a paddock clean for 6 months. But if a paddock's clean for 6 months because it hasn't had any stock on it, your grass utilisation for the farm is not very good. And in most areas, that feed will be way too high. They can't quite see that, but it'll be a foot tall, and therefore the quality of the pasture is no longer very good for young animals or for any sheep or goats for that matter. If you think about the life cycle I touched on at the start, the first 3 weeks post any effective drench should cause nil contamination of the pasture. So we can go in with a really heavy graze the 3 weeks after we've drenched animals, and knowing that they're harvesting all the larvae on that pasture, and then we can move them off it, let it freshen up, and it should be a relatively clean paddock for other animals to come on. So just don't think about that. Particularly heading into weaning, you want to be thinking about how do we prepare a clean paddock. The other thing that's really useful, I've spoken about summer and the need for the sunlight to kill worms. Summer does kill worms, but it only kills worms if those worms are exposed to the sun. And a classic example is underutilized and undergrazed farms. Worms can survive and stay in the shelter of the shade of 3 or 4 tonne of dry matter, and they can actually survive that summer. Whereas if we graze paddocks very, very heavily early in the summer, we can ensure that the sun will do a job of killing the worms. And as always, monitor stock regularly to ensure that we don't have heavily contaminated paddocks. Just wanted to touch on the mode of action, well, not the mode of action, but the length of action of chemicals, and really just trying to highlight here that there's one chemical, but it has a short-acting and a long-acting version, the moxidectin, which has residual activity, which is very, very handy. But we're talking about black scourworm today, and the residual activity of these drenches against black scourworm is nowhere near as long as what it is for barber's pole and brown stomach worm. And I just think it's a really important thing to note, because it's really easy to jump, if you think about long-acting moxidectin, it's really easy to jump on the fact that it has 90 days protection against barber's pole and forget that it actually only has 49 days protection against black scourworm. Still wonderful it has 49 days protection, and that's assuming it's working well on your farm. But I guess my point is here is that 2 months after you administer this product, it is potential that sheep are starting to pick up significant numbers of black scourworm. And if you're in a high black scourworm environment, you might see sheep dying with a worm burden 3 months after they were administered that product. So I'm definitely not bagging the product. I'm just making the point that the length of action is shorter against black scourworm than it is against our other 2 sort of production limiting worm species. And essentially for all our other drenches, it kills them the day you give it, and then it's out of the system and has no residual. But yeah, just something to think about. And with our short-acting moxidectin, there's no label claim for any extended length of action against black scourworm, where there's 14 days for the barber's pole and the brown stomach worm. So just trying to draw your attention to that one, that's all. Just want to talk about drench choices, and again, I am only focusing on the black scourworm. So I know there'll be different advice to this when we're dealing with barber's pole, but today's focus is on black scourworm. Look, I like to try and keep things relatively simple on farms, and I think it's a combination of best practice and what we can afford. And if money wasn't an issue, the best way to kill worms would be come in with every drench combination every time. But we've got to be mindful that we are trying to run businesses and we're trying to make money. So my general advice is, when we've got green grass and we know that there's going to be recontamination relatively quickly, we should be using a triple combination, because it generally works very, very well. And it's relatively well priced at sort of 40 to 45 cents for a 50 kilo sheep. Whereas once we move to the summer months, and we know that when we drench animals, the need for re-drenching should be much greatly reduced because we're not getting reinfection. That's where I think we're best placed to use our very best products, which is our StarTech and our Zolvix Plus. And they're obviously the trade names. They're the only two, well, they're both, there's only one product for each of those chemicals. So I don't have a problem with saying the trade names. But that's the key to my general advice is when you've got green grass, use a triple combination drench. And when we're moving to those summer times when we're more selective for drench resistance, let's use the StarTech and the Zolvix Pluses. Now, a drench resistance test is the only way to really know what you should be using. But if you don't have one, I think that's a reasonable way to go. And the other thing I would encourage people to think about doing is do lots of regular drench checks. So, several times throughout the year when you come in and drench with the triple combination, let's test the animals 12 to 14 days later and see how well they're working. And the same thing with the StarTech and the Zolvix Plus. I think in practice, a lot of people talk about doing drench resistance tests, but they don't do them as frequently as they should. We should be doing them every 2 or 3 years. But it's really easy to come in 10 to 14 days later and just test the products you're using. If they keep coming back at all zeros every time, you can have confidence that what you're using is working. But if you start seeing, 30s and 40s coming across out of 30, 40 eggs per gram out of sheep that were 300 or 400 pre-drenching, then you're starting to see a bit of a resistance issue, and you might fast track that drench resistance test because that you've been thinking about doing it because you start to realise that you do actually have a problem emerging on your farm. And I just think it's a really simple way to know whether your drenches are working. And the other thing that's really effective about it, or wonderful about it, I think, is with some of our farms becoming bigger and bigger and employing staff, it's a great way to go and test 10 individuals and give the feedback to your workers or your contractors and say, hey, every animal there out of those 10 was drenched. That's fantastic. Whereas if you start to see 2 or 3 animals coming back with high egg counts and the rest are zeros, you actually know that the drenching job's been pretty sloppy. So it's a good way to have confidence in the staff around you that it is working. And I don't think it doesn't need to be seen as that you're testing them. It's actually just giving everyone confidence that the job is being done appropriately. And that is the end of my presentation. So, questions?
Thanks, Andrew. That was great. Got questions coming through now. We've got a couple that have already arrived and more that are coming through now. So we'll kick off with the first one. It's from Jeremy. Andrew, we expect counts to be 0 18 days after drenching. Is it possible mature worms can be ingested by the sheep prior to day 18 and start laying?
No, it's not. So animals ingest the immature larvae off the pasture, and it essentially takes 18 days for that larvae to become an adult and start to put out eggs. Look, technically you might see them 1 or 2 days earlier, but very, very few. So it does depend on the worm species, and we generally say it's 18 to 21 days before they will start, before an immature larvae ingested will become an adult and start to put eggs out. But look, if you said day 16, absolutely not. They should not be laying any eggs within 16 days. Some of them will sort of start around that sort of 17, 18 day period.
Thanks, Andrew. Next one's from Emily. Can a low level burden of black scour worm encourage animals to hunt for high moisture pastures for hydration needs, which might exacerbate the scour issues even though burdens are low?
Can a low level of, I guess, no, I don't. Look, I don't know the answer. It's a good question. I don't think so. I mean, it's not how I would think that an animal behaves, and I'm not aware of any evidence to suggest that animals that are getting dehydrated go and consume pasture that's of a higher moisture content. So I don't. I mean, the one thing we do know is that black scour worm burdens actually reduce appetite. And that really exacerbates the problem because they stop eating and therefore their immune system is compromised because they're not eating as much, and then the dehydration kicks in quicker because of the failure to eat and drink. So, but I wouldn't expect that low levels would encourage them to select pasture that's higher in moisture. I will make one point though. Animals that are scouring will in some ways reduce the egg count of the mob. And I guess what's a little bit confusing with egg counts is that it's an egg count per gram, so it's eggs per gram of feces. And if you think about a scouring animal, it's putting out many more kilos of feces every day than an animal with a solid feces. So what that does mean is sometimes when we've got a scouring animal, the egg count is actually not as high as what it otherwise would be. But when sheep are worming and they're getting scours, the egg count is still high enough that we would be drenching.
A message from Helena. Last summer, where she's from, it doesn't state where it is, unfortunately. In particular, we had months on end with high temperatures, but 100% humidity. Does this affect the time to spell paddocks over summer? Yes, absolutely. So the warmer it is, the more active the worm is, and therefore the quicker it dies if there's nothing there to ingest it. So, I don't actually have the chart in front of me, and I think you'll see it on the WormBoss website. There's a really good chart, and it's taken for barber's pole, but we can think about it as relatively similar for other worms. But I think it's something like 3 to 4 weeks in summer is the equivalent to about 5 or 6 months in winter. And that's the temperature difference is the key there. That animals, worms, they're far more active when it's warm, and therefore they essentially run out of energy and die if they're not consumed. So hot weather is great for killing worms. Do you promote, from John, do you promote breeding for worm resistance and low scouring, as in low wet scouring? Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that you need to be conscious of, and it's a sort of a technical thing for the breeders out there. But I'm pretty sure John did the work on this, but that I could be wrong about that. But there's a good body of work out there that sort of showed that if you only select for worm resistance in terms of low egg counts, you can I guess accidentally select for animals that are more likely to scour, and it's because of what I explained before, that because you've got that high moisture content in the feces, the actual egg count of some of these animals can be low, but they're actually putting out a high volume of eggs per day in their scours. So it's something we need to be mindful of, is that combination of avoiding sheep with hypersensitivity scours, where they scour at a lower threshold of worms within the animal, and therefore they've got low egg counts, but they've got an increased propensity to scour at a low egg count. So I think the combination of looking at DAG score and low egg count is important. Again, this depends whether that's something that's affecting your flock or not. And Hamilton is a classic where we see lots of scoury sheep in the middle of winter, and the need for selecting for DAG score is important. There's other areas where DAG is very rarely an issue. Next question from Richard. Is there any way of reducing larvae on pastures other than spelling them? Will spraying out a pasture remove the larvae? Look, I'm not aware of any chemicals available to spray on pasture to kill larvae. I remember hearing at uni that citric acid kills worms, but I'm not, no one's ever formulated a product that's available. So short of spelling a paddock or using animals to harvest the larvae, sheep that are capsule, sheep that have just been drenched, that have got a low worm egg count, there's not really any other effective ways other than sort of what we've discussed. Oh, I read that question, interpreted that question a little bit differently, Andrew, in that I think he may have been suggesting, either way anyway, if he sprays the pasture out and then maybe leaves it fallow ready for re-sowing.
Well, yeah, fallow. If you leave a fallow for summer, that'll have great. 6 months over summer, you will massively minimise the number of worms on that paddock.
Question from Luke. Can you please discuss the incidence of L4 larvae not being killed but remaining hibernated or in shock shortly after drenching? Can this phenomenon give a false negative worm egg count?
Look, I'm not sure how much of this, really happens in practice. I know it's something that people talk about, that if you go and do an egg count 5 or 6 days after sheep have been drenched, that potentially you've got worms in there that have been damaged, but they're not killed, and therefore the egg count will be lower. But if we're coming in day 14, day 16, that's not something that we really, as far as I'm aware, that's not something that we're really concerned about at day 14, day 16. But it's the reason why we recommend minimum of 10 days to check how well a worm burden, how well we've killed the worms. But yeah, rather than coming in day 5, day 6, we delay it to sort of 10 to 14 days after they were drenched. And therefore you shouldn't, waiting that long, there shouldn't be an issue with these sort of stunned larvae as such.
Thanks, Andrew. If you use a highly effective new active or combo over summer, are you fast tracking resistance?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you're killing worms as well as you can, and that is an important part of our drench resistance management is using effective products. I guess, how do we minimise the drench? So take back a step. Our most effective drenches that we use generally have, in a way, the highest selection pressure on resistance. And the reason I say that is if you think about killing worms in summer, that the environment does such a good job of killing our worms, that the only worms, or a greater percentage of the worms that survive, will be worms that have survived within the stomach or the intestines of the animal. And therefore those, when autumn comes along, they will make up a bigger percentage of the farm. So technically, yes, that is true, but we've still got to work on killing as many worms as possible. And I guess the common practice now to avoid putting extra pressure on worms is to leave a percentage of the farm undrenched over that summer period. And that's something in our adult sheep we should always be doing, adult cattle, adult goats. In animals that aren't super susceptible to worms, if we can leave a percentage of them, 5% undrenched, that will leave plenty of worms, essentially in refugia, that can crossbreed against any small number of surviving worms. But we've still got to use our best products over summer to kill worms, or you start using a product that's at 95, 96% because you're scared of using those drenches that are your best drenches. You'll end up just drenching all winter and have a bigger problem far quicker.
Andrew, could we please clarify the advice about letting treated sheep eat out a paddock 3 weeks post-drench to clean the worm burdens up in that paddock? I missed this point in your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, if we drench sheep today, and I spoke about this in depth, and I'm happy to talk about it again. If we drench sheep today, they should be relatively worm-free for the next 18 to 21 days. And look, I'm just rounding it up and saying for 3 weeks. So if what that means is we've got a wormy paddock and we drench sheep today, we can put them in that paddock and we can bloody graze the hell out of it for the next 3 weeks, and we will actually essentially harvest a lot of the larvae that are on that pasture, so that then we move those sheep at the end of the 3 weeks and we let that pasture freshen up. It will be far lower risk for worms than what it would have been otherwise. So essentially it only works with sheep that have got a low worm egg count. So that can be sheep that have been drenched, or it can be animals that you've tested and know that they've got a very low worm egg count, and then you put them in there. But principle is sheep drenched with an effective drench should stay clear for 3 weeks.
And a counter question to that. So would that work with lactating ewes, or would they need to be dry?
So it'll work with lactating ewes if they've got a low worm egg count. And that, you know, there's farms where that will happen, and there's farms where they're not. A good example would be sheep that are capsuled. So if you're using capsules on your farm to manage worms, they should leave a paddock very, very clean. Sure, there might be some resistant worms there, but it should be a very clean paddock. Similarly, if you had ewes that you brought in at lamb marking time and you drenched at lamb marking, well, you'd be comfortable that they're going to go out and be very worm free for 3 weeks. So really just depends on, do you know that those sheep have a lower worm egg count or not, which is, have they been drenched recently or have they had a worm egg count recently? So any class of stock could be effective. Weaners can actually create a fairly clean paddock if they're drenched into that paddock. So yeah, just think about, is the egg count high or have they been drenched in the last 3 weeks?
Any experience with tannin containing pasture species?
No. So
watch this space, John. I'm in the middle of writing an article for our next newsletter on this topic, so watch this space. That rounds off today's question and answers. If anyone's got any more questions, now's your time, really quick, to type them in. I'll check the question box again before we clear off. I'll just share my screen back with you all now, and we'll just have a few finishing up slides here for you. Here we go. So a follow-up survey. Thank you everyone in advance for filling it out. We love your feedback here at ParaBoss. The link will be launched straight away at the end of this presentation, so you don't even have to click on anything. It'll only take a couple of quick minutes, 5 short questions. So thank you very much for taking the time. And this is being recorded, and the recording will be available on YouTube shortly. And our next webinar will be coccidiosis in livestock on the 19th of July at 1 p.m. So watch our social media for the links for that webinar. So that's it for us today. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us. We hope you enjoy the rest of your conference down south. It's lovely to have you join today and share your knowledge with all our listeners. No, we're still Andrew muted.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, I'll go to the Melbourne airport now.
No worries. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Megan, for running things behind the scenes for us today. It was lovely to have you on board. That's it for today, everyone. We'll see you again next month. Bye for now.